Hey, it's Mike from the Throttlestop. Of course, we're talking Pontiacs today. I got my two guys, Mark and Wade here. We got our parts collection here. I thought we'd kind of go over and touch base on a couple cool pieces that we got here. Anything that you guys see, you guys want to talk about? Let's start at the top. What do you guys see up there that you guys like?
Well, Mike, the first thing we see up here is a dual quad manifold. Looks like single plane for a Ram Air 5. As we discussed in the previous video, the Ram Air 5 was based on the Ford tunnel port, and I can tell looking at this particular manifold, it does not have the correct numbers or the firing order on it. So while it looks like an original Ram Air 5 dual quad manifold, it's actually from a Ford that was converted to fit a Pontiac. And that's not surprising, as the originals are extremely rare. I think there are 2 or 3 known to exist at this point. I'm lucky enough to have one on one of my cars, and at some point you guys can come down and check that out and we can show you what that's all about. But yeah, a very nice piece here with the factory dual quad manifold.
And it is something to say how close of a design that the Ford / Pontiac guys
Absolutely. It was
copied.
It was literally stolen from Ford.
Yes, you can take a 427 Ford crank and drop it in a Pontiac, and you can bolt a 427 head on a 400 Pontiac except for one bolt.
That's amazing. I definitely trust you on that. So that dual quad intake, of course, really is a cool piece. It was a made piece, as you were saying. The other 2 chrome intakes that are up there, one's a short deck and one's a standard deck. But we were just talking about a couple of different features of that. I don't know if one of you guys want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, you can clearly see on the 400 that it's the wider spacing, and then that's where, when we were talking about earlier in the other video, there's a divot for the Holley carburetor that was specific on the Ram Air 5 400 versus around the corner here, we've got a short deck 303 intake, which looks more like a conventional small block Chevy, where the carb pad is 3/4 of an inch higher and didn't need that divot. We also then look as that 303, there's another 303 intake here that the Throttlestop has set up with an actual 303 carburetor. And in front of that is a fairly neat, another electronic distributor. I think Wade knows a few things about that.
Sure, Mark. And we wanted to also point out that the 303, as we mentioned earlier, was a short deck motor. So it's a much narrower intake manifold than the...
So like the block deck height is
Correct.
Lower.
The block
so like,
deck
as
is
that
lower,
out,
makes the intake narrower. That's correct. It can be used on a 400, but it would require spacers. As Mark pointed out here, we've got a distributor here that is a Ram Air 5 distributor, and the oil pumps on the Ram Air 5 were an 80-pound pump, much like the 455 Super Duty that came later. And so because of that and wear that they had under the distributor gears, they used a larger distributor gear and a smaller gear on the cam. And so Ram Air 5 cams from the factory had small gears, as did the later production 455 Super Duty.
and why did they have the bigger hole basically in the block?
The blocks on the Super Duties and the Ram Air 5s also had a larger hole to accommodate that larger gear. And as you can see, they used a distributor housing, but they pressed a sleeve onto the housing to take up that extra space. So the gear had to clear the block, and the spacer filled that in.
And typically that distributor, as I know, ends in like 1972. I just remember that as like a year.
That's correct.
That's like the last 4 digits. It might be like 11111. But we have some extra stampings on this one that I guess we're learning about.
Yeah, there's a lot of Ram Air 5 stuff you will find, especially the stuff that came through the back door, had a lot of numbers stamped on it for engineering purposes. And sometimes we can figure out what those are, and other times it's anybody's guess.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right, yeah, absolutely. And of course, I know you mentioned Super Duty. A lot of the parts display here, we do have a lot of Super Duty stuff, including like aluminum exhaust manifolds, the upside down starter, just about every configuration of a 62 to 63 Pontiac Super Duty intake. We even have a 65 tri-power on here. And so we do love our Pontiac stuff. We love the pieces. A lot of times those turn into the next project. We have a project going on right now where we're building a 63 421 3-barrel, which was raised again in 1963. So a lot of parts that you see here today may end up in the project next in line. What else do you guys see that you like on the Ram Air 5 stuff?
Well, the crankshaft is an interesting piece that the Ram Air 5 used a forging rather than a cast iron or cast steel crank. And this particular one, while very similar and probably produced by the same forging houses, which were typically Kellogg or Moldex, this particular one here is actually from the early Super Duty program. It's a 63 421 SD crank, a 990 crank as they're known. And you can usually tell from the short snout on the front compared to the longer snout on the later ones. There are typically numbers on them. Sometimes they're hard to see or they're ground off during balancing. So sometimes it's hard to tell, but very few Pontiac forged cranks were actually produced, and they are very rare. Even though you can buy them new today, the originals are very hard to come by.
And what's so neat too, that you guys are actually doing a lot of studying on something like a crank, where most people, if they're going to build an engine today, they're just going and buying an aftermarket scat or insert aftermarket brand, where you guys are actually doing a little bit of homework on the original Ram Air 5 stuff that most people really overlook or don't really care that much about because it's not on the exterior, it's not visible.
Correct.
You know, everybody wants to have the correct intake, the correct carburetor, the correct number 44 heads, all that stuff. But then when it comes to something on the internal side, it's not that big of a deal because no one's going to see it. However, you guys are really putting in some research on that.
Yeah, we're looking at from an engineering perspective, kind of, like Wade 69 Judge was an engineering exercise. We look at, the history of the 62, 63 Super Duty stuff, how then it falls into some of the Ram Air 5 stuff, which again then also falls into the 73, 74 Super Duty 455. But again, it's about numbers like this engine here, this combination that I think you said is going to be a new project on some of the heads, on the ends of the exhaust ports. There's number stamped, much like on the distributor. And that's kind of the history or what Wade and I have been pursuing and trying to figure out and educate ourselves to understand maybe what the engineers were trying to say or do.
And do you think that was be like, this is project number 5305, or do you think the 5305, I'm making up a number, but do you think that was telling a different story?
Possibly maybe testing, again, back to the dual quad intakes. Wade has one that has some pitot tubes, and there's some numbers on his intake, possibly referencing to a test or a date, or maybe a batch. We're not well versed on all the engineering practices, but we're trying to learn.
Yeah, I always think it's such a wild time from 61 to 74, where every year Pontiac had something different, something exciting, something just happening in racing up to 63 when they banned it. 64 they get the GTO, and now they're owning the streets, and the muscle car is going nuts. And then Ram Air 1, Ram Air 2, Ram Air, and all that progression into what we're talking about today, the Ram Air 5 stuff, which is just the rarest, coolest, hardest to find, unobtainium stuff that even people that knew about it back then didn't know about it.
Yeah,
Right.
and like you have, which maybe people don't understand it, but the rocket racing, the gaskets, you just can't find like NOS stock like that, and it's just a beautiful display, and that people can reminisce and see what you could buy as speed parts back in the day.
Right. Yeah, another interesting part on this particular motor here, if you look close, is the damper here. That damper is specific to the Ram Air 5. You can see it's much larger than the factory damper, and those are very difficult to come by as well. And this particular motor happens to have that piece on it, so it's very nice.
And honestly, like when you look for Pontiac stuff specifically, that balancer or the one that's next to you on that Super Duty,
Right.
it's very identifiable as it's not normal. It's not run of the mill. It's not the
Yeah, that's one of the things I really love about Ram Air 5 parts is there are a lot of parts out there on cars that are faked. They've got, just stamp numbers and they're not original. A lot of the Ram Air 5 stuff, you can't fake it because it's so completely different from anything else that's out there that it just is what it is, and there's no way to make it look like something it's not. So one of the things I really like about it.
yeah. No, that's awesome. And anything else down there that's striking the chord
Well,
with you guys?
what were you you got a project going on here you were gonna tell us about?
So that is our, I believe that's Kinsler mechanical fuel injection.
Yeah, actually, I am familiar with this. I have a couple of these, and one in progress on a car right now. And most people do think that is Kinsler or Hilborn.
Wow.
And yep, it was made by a gentleman whose name was Al Gonzalez, I believe. Correct?
Oh, yes.
And so it's actually an Algon piece.
Okay.
And while not nearly as popular as Hilborn and Kinsler, he made a lot of unusual parts for some of the odd makes. And this particular one is for a Ram Air 5, which is pretty amazing considering so few were produced.
And that is really going to be a next project kind of coming out for us, is that we're going to build, I believe, about a 455 base cubic inch engine featuring that intake setup with those cylinder heads. And again, it's going to go into a engine run display and possibly into a car. And you're going to do the same with yours?
That is correct. And like I say, I'll have to have you guys down and you can check it out.
Oh, yeah. I got to tell you, it's been awesome having you guys out here today. I've learned so much about this stuff. It never, I think we all learn things every day in this thing.
Absolutely.
And just learning more from you guys. You guys are really the experts. I know a little. That's about it. But again, thanks so much for tuning in. Please have comments. Again, I'm Mike from the Throttlestop. We are driven by passion.